The auction house was packed that afternoon, filled with the sharp smell of livestock and the constant murmur of ranchers discussing prices. Harold Foster stood in the back, his white cowboy hat pulled low over his eyes, watching the parade of cattle being led through the ring. At 72 years old, he wasn't there to buy. He had come simply because staying home felt unbearable. The silence of his empty farmhouse had become too heavy to bear since Elizabeth passed away 6 months ago. 49 years of marriage, and now the house echoed with her absence in every corner. The auctioneer, Vince Harlow, was a loud man with a booming voice and a smile that never quite reached his eyes. He moved through the lots quickly, his gavel striking down on sale after sale. Harold barely paid attention until he heard the laughter. It started as a few chuckles, then spread through the crowd like wildfire. He looked up and felt his chest tighten. Being led into the ring was a bull unlike any he had ever seen at an auction. The animal was skeletal, his ribs visible through dull, patchy brown hide. His legs trembled with each step, and there was a deep gash along his shoulder that looked infected. One horn was chipped, and his eyes held a look Harold recognized all too well. Defeat. "Now, folks, I know what you're thinking," Vince announced with a smirk. "But every lot gets its chance, right? This here bull, well, let's just say he's seen better days. Opening bid at $50. Do I hear 50? The crowd erupted in laughter. Someone shouted, "You'd have to pay me to take that thing." Another voice called out, "That bull's got 1 foot in the grave already." Vince chuckled along with them. "Come on now. Surely someone wants to take him off our hands. $50, anyone? How about 25? More laughter. Harold felt something twist inside his chest. The bull stood there in the center of the ring, surrounded by mockery, his head hanging low. In that moment, Harold didn't see a dying animal. He saw Elizabeth in her hospital bed during those final weeks, when the doctors had given up, when the nurses spoke in hushed, pitying tones. He saw the way people had looked at her toward the end, with sympathy, yes, but also with that unspoken relief that it wasn't them. $10. Harold's voice cut through the laughter. The auction house fell silent. Heads turned. Vince's eyebrows shot up in genuine surprise. "Well, well, we have a bid. $10 from the gentleman in the back. Do I hear 15? Silence. Vince scanned the crowd, his smile widening. Going once, going twice. The gavel came down with a crack that seemed to echo forever. Sold to Harold Foster for $10. The crowd burst into fresh laughter, louder than before. Harold heard the whispers as he made his way to the front. Old fool, throwing money away. Griefs made him soft in the head. Vince handed him the papers with a grin that made Harold's stomach turn. "Pleasure doing business with you, Harold. Though I gotta say, you just bought yourself a one-way ticket to the renderer. That bull won't last the week." Harold didn't respond. He took the lead rope and approached the bull slowly. Up close, the animal looked even worse. His breathing was labored, and flies buzzed around the untreated wound on his shoulder. But when Harold gently touched his neck, the bull raised his head slightly. Their eyes met, and Harold felt it. That same desperate plea Elizabeth's eyes had held when she whispered, "Don't give up on me yet." His hand trembled as he stroked the bull's rough hide. "You and me both, friend," he murmured quietly. "You and me both." As Harold led the bull toward his trailer, he passed by Ruth Campbell, his neighbor, who had been sitting quietly in the stands. She was one of the few who hadn't laughed. Ruth caught up with him outside. "Harold, what are you doing?" she asked gently, concern etched on her weathered face. He paused, looking at the broken animal beside him. "I don't rightly know, Ruth. I couldn't let him go like that. Not without at least trying." Ruth studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Elizabeth would have done the same thing," she said softly. Harold felt tears prick his eyes but blinked them away. "Yeah, she would have." Loading the bull into the trailer took nearly 20 minutes. The animal could barely walk, and Harold had to support much of his weight. By the time they pulled away from the auction house, the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold. Harold glanced in his rearview mirror at the bull swaying unsteadily in the trailer. What had he just done? He had no plan, no real hope that this animal would survive. But as they drove down the empty country road toward his farm, Harold realized something. For the first time in 6 months, he had something to care for again, something that needed him. And maybe, just maybe, that would be enough to fill the crushing emptiness, even if only for a little while. The farm looked smaller than it used to, or maybe Harold had just grown tired of its vastness. He pulled the truck up to the old barn and sat for a moment, listening to the engine tick as it cooled. Through the side mirror, he could see the bull standing motionless in the trailer, his head lowered. Harold climbed out slowly, his joints protesting after the long day. The evening air was cool, carrying the scent of hay and earth. He opened the trailer gate carefully, half expecting the bull to collapse right then and there. "Easy now," Harold spoke softly, extending his hand. "Let's get you inside where it's warm." The bull moved like every step caused pain, his hooves scraping against the metal ramp. It took several minutes just to walk the 30 feet from the trailer to the barn. Harold had prepared a stall earlier that week, though he hadn't known why at the time. Now it seemed almost like fate. Fresh straw covered the floor, and he'd filled the water trough that morning out of habit, even though he had no animals left. Elizabeth had always insisted on keeping the barn ready. "You never know when something might need shelter," she used to say. Harold guided the bull into the stall and removed the lead rope. The animal immediately lay down, his legs folding beneath him with a heavy sigh. Up close, in the dim light of the barn, Harold could see just how dire the situation truly was. The wound on the bull's shoulder was worse than he'd thought, oozing and attracting flies. His breathing came in shallow, rattling gasps. Harold fetched his medical kit, the same one he'd used for livestock years ago when he still ran a full operation. His hands shook slightly as he cleaned the wound with antiseptic. The bull barely moved, too weak even to flinch at the sting. "I know it hurts," Harold murmured, working as gently as he could. "But we've got to get you cleaned up." As he worked, he found himself talking more, filling the silence that had haunted him for months. "My wife Elizabeth, she'd have known exactly what to do. She had a way with hurting things. Could calm a spooked horse with just her voice. Me, I'm all thumbs and rough edges." He applied antibiotic ointment and wrapped the wound as best he could. The bull's eyes followed his movements, and Harold could have sworn he saw something like gratitude in that dark gaze. "We're going to call you Millionaire," Harold said suddenly, surprising himself, "because you're going to be worth more than anyone thinks. You just wait." The next morning, Harold called Travis Mason, the local veterinarian. Travis arrived around 10, his truck kicking up dust as it rolled down the long driveway. He was a practical man in his mid-50s, with calloused hands and a no-nonsense attitude shaped by decades of ranch work. When Harold led him to the barn, Travis took one look at Millionaire and let out a low whistle. "Harold, what in God's name were you thinking?" He knelt beside the bull, examining him with experienced hands. "This animal is severely malnourished, dehydrated, and that shoulder wound is infected. He's probably got internal parasites, and from the sound of his breathing, I'd say he's got respiratory issues too." Harold stood with his arms crossed, his jaw set. "Can you help him?" Travis stood up, brushing straw from his knees. He looked at Harold with something between pity and frustration. "Help him? Harold, the kindest thing you could do right now is put him down. He's suffering." The words hit Harold like a physical blow. "No." Travis sighed heavily. "Look, I understand you've been through a lot. Losing Elizabeth was hard on all of us. She was a good woman. But this," he gestured at Millionaire, "this isn't going to bring her back. This bull is dying, and dragging it out isn't mercy." Harold's voice came out harder than he intended. "I said no. I'm not putting him down. If you won't help me, I'll do it myself." The two men stared at each other for a long moment. Finally, Travis shook his head and reached into his bag. "You're a stubborn old fool, Harold Foster." He pulled out bottles of antibiotics and anti-inflammatories. "Give him these twice a day. Get fluids in him any way you can. Change that bandage daily. And call me if when things go south." Harold took the medications, his throat tight. "Thank you, Travis." The veterinarian paused at the barn door. "Don't thank me yet. I give him 3 days, maybe 4. I've seen this before. Sometimes the body just gives up." After Travis left, Harold sat down on an overturned bucket next to Millionaire's stall. The bull's breathing seemed even more labored than before. That afternoon, Ruth stopped by with a casserole. She found Harold in the barn, trying to get Millionaire to drink water from a bucket. "Any luck?" she asked. Harold shook his head. "He won't touch it, won't eat either." Ruth set the casserole down and came closer, studying the bull with her keen eyes. "You know what Elizabeth used to do with sick calves?" Harold looked up. "What?" Ruth smiled softly. "She'd sing to them, said it calmed them down enough to eat." Harold felt his chest constrict. He remembered. Elizabeth had sung old hymns in a voice that wasn't particularly beautiful, but was filled with such warmth that it didn't matter. "I can't sing, Ruth." She patted his shoulder. Neither could she, really, but that never stopped her. After Ruth left, Harold sat alone in the gathering darkness of the barn. Millionaire lay still, his sides barely rising and falling. Harold cleared his throat awkwardly and began to hum, then quietly sing an old hymn Elizabeth had loved. His voice cracked and wavered, but he kept going. And whether it was coincidence or something more, when he offered the water bucket again, Millionaire lifted his head slightly and took a small drink. It wasn't much, but it was something. For the first time since the auction, Harold felt a tiny spark of hope flicker to life in his chest. The days that followed were the hardest Harold had faced since Elizabeth's funeral. He moved into the barn, sleeping on a cot he dragged from the house, because Millionaire needed round-the-clock care. Every 2 hours, he administered medication, changed bandages, and tried to coax the bull to eat. He mixed warm mash with molasses, remembering how Elizabeth used to say that sick animals needed something sweet to remind them life was worth living. Sometimes Millionaire would eat a few bites. More often, he refused entirely. By the 5th day, word had spread through the small farming community. Harold's phone rang constantly with neighbors offering unsolicited advice or thinly veiled criticism. Some were genuinely concerned. Others thought he'd lost his mind. When he went into town for more supplies, he felt the stares, heard the whispers. At the feed store, the clerk gave him a pitying look. "Heard you bought that dying bull from the auction." "That true?" Harold paid for his purchases without meeting the man's eyes. "Yes." The clerk shook his head. "My cousin was there. Said it was the saddest thing he'd ever seen. The bull, I mean. Not worth the bullet to put it down." Harold took his change and left without another word. But slowly, impossibly, things began to change. On the 8th day, Millionaire stood on his own for the first time. It took him 3 attempts, his legs shaking violently, but he made it to his feet and stayed there for nearly 5 minutes. Harold watched from the stall door, hardly daring to breathe. On the 10th day, the bull walked across the stall to drink water without Harold's help. The wound on his shoulder, though still angry and red, had stopped oozing. On the 14th day, Millionaire ate an entire bucket of mash and hay. Harold sat on his cot that night, looking at the bull who was now standing more than lying down, and felt tears roll down his weathered cheeks. "You're fighting," he whispered, just like she did. Ruth visited every few days, always bringing food Harold barely touched, always offering quiet encouragement. One afternoon, about 3 weeks after the auction, she found Harold brushing Millionaire's coat. The bull's ribs were still visible, but less pronounced. His eyes had lost that glazed look of defeat. "He's looking better," Ruth said, genuine surprise in her voice. Harold nodded, running the brush along Millionaire's neck. The bull leaned into the touch slightly. "He's a fighter, stronger than anyone gave him credit for." Ruth watched them together. "You know people are taking bets in town on how long he'll last." Harold's jaw tightened. "Let them. We'll prove them all wrong." But just when Harold began to believe they'd turned a corner, disaster struck. It happened on a Tuesday night, exactly 4 weeks after the auction. Harold woke to the sound of Millionaire thrashing in his stall. He scrambled from his cot, his heart pounding. The bull was on his side, his legs kicking weakly, foam gathering at his mouth. His breathing came in terrible, gasping wheezes. "No, no, no." Harold fumbled for his phone and called Travis. The veterinarian arrived within 30 minutes, still in his pajamas. He examined Millionaire quickly, his expression growing grimmer by the second. "It's pneumonia," Travis said finally. "His lungs are filled with fluid, combined with his weakened state." He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. Harold felt the ground shift beneath him. "What can we do?" Travis was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was gentle but firm. "Harold, we've talked about this. You've given him a chance. You've done more than anyone would have. But this, pneumonia in his condition, he won't survive it. The kindest thing, the merciful thing, is to let him go peacefully. I can do it right now. He won't feel any pain." The barn fell silent, except for Millionaire's labored breathing. Harold looked at the bull. This broken creature he'd spent a month nursing. This living thing that had given him a reason to wake up each morning. In Millionaire's eyes, he saw the same plea he'd seen at the auction, the same desperate hope that someone, anyone, would keep fighting when everyone else had given up. He thought of Elizabeth in that hospital bed, when the doctors had recommended stopping treatment, making her comfortable, letting her go. He'd refused then, too. She'd lived another 3 months. 3 precious months of holding her hand, telling her stories, watching sunrises together. 3 months that he wouldn't trade for anything in the world, even though the ending had been the same. Harold's voice came out rough, choked with emotion. No. Travis closed his eyes. Harold, I said no. Harold's voice cracked. I'm not giving up on him. Not yet. Not while he's still fighting. Travis packed his bag slowly. Then we start antibiotics. Strong ones. But Harold, you need to understand the odds are not good. This could be dragging out the inevitable. And it won't be easy. For either of you. Harold knelt beside Millionaire, placing his weathered hand on the bull's heaving side. Nothing worth having ever is. After Travis left, Harold stayed on the floor beside Millionaire through the long night. He talked to the bull the way he used to talk to Elizabeth during her worst nights, filling the darkness with memories and promises and prayers he wasn't sure anyone was hearing. You can't quit on me now, he whispered, as the first light of dawn crept through the barn windows. We've come too far. You and me, we're fighters. We don't know how to quit. Millionaire's eye rolled toward him, and Harold could have sworn he saw understanding there. So just hold on a little longer, Harold pleaded, his voice breaking. Just hold on. The next 72 hours were a blur of sleepless nights and desperate measures. Harold administered antibiotics every 4 hours, set up a humidifier in the stall to help Millionaire breathe, and used warm compresses on the bull's chest. Travis stopped by twice a day, his skepticism slowly giving way to cautious amazement. His fever's down 1/2 degree, he'd say, checking his thermometer. Or the fluid in his lungs is decreasing. Not much, but it's something. Each small victory felt monumental. Ruth brought soup and coffee, forcing Harold to eat, even when he insisted he wasn't hungry. You're no good to him if you collapse, she said firmly, sitting beside him on the barn floor. Harold spooned the soup mechanically, his eyes never leaving Millionaire. I keep thinking about the day I bought him. Everyone laughing. Vince Harlow grinning like he'd just robbed me blind. Ruth was quiet for a moment. And now? Harold managed a tired smile. Now I'd pay 1,000 times what I did just to see him stand up again. On the 4th day after the pneumonia diagnosis, Millionaire opened his eyes fully for the first time. The glazed, distant look was gone. He was present, aware. When Harold brought water, the bull drank deeply, his throat working steadily. By evening, he was eating small amounts of hay. Travis stood at the stall door, shaking his head in disbelief. I've been a veterinarian for 28 years. I've seen a lot of things, but this, he gestured at Millionaire, this shouldn't be possible. By every metric, every piece of medical knowledge I have, this bull should be dead. Harold leaned against the stall, exhaustion written in every line of his face. Maybe some things don't follow the rules we think they should. A week later, Millionaire stood on his own and walked the length of the stall without stumbling. The wound on his shoulder had healed into a thick scar. His coat, though still patchy in places, was beginning to shine. He'd gained weight, his ribs no longer protruding quite so sharply. Harold let him out into the small paddock attached to the barn for the first time. Watching Millionaire take those tentative steps into the sunlight, seeing him lower his head to nibble at the grass, Harold felt something break open inside his chest. He sat down on the fence rail and wept openly. Great heaving sobs of relief and grief and gratitude all tangled together. That's when Ruth arrived with a stranger. Harold, she called out. There's someone here to see you. This is Dr. Gerald Preston. Harold wiped his eyes quickly and turned. Dr. Preston was a distinguished-looking man in his early 60s, with silver hair and sharp, intelligent eyes. He wore khaki pants and a button-down shirt and carried a leather notebook. Mr. Foster, Preston extended his hand. I hope I'm not intruding. I was visiting Ruth to examine her mare, and she mentioned you had acquired a bull recently. I have something of a professional interest in cattle genetics and bloodlines. Harold shook his hand, confused. I'm not sure what you'd want with Millionaire. He's not much to look at. Preston smiled. May I see him? Harold led him to the paddock where Millionaire was grazing. Preston stood at the fence for a long moment, studying the bull intently. Then his eyes widened. He climbed over the fence with surprising agility and approached Millionaire slowly. The bull raised his head, watching the stranger warily, but not moving away. Preston circled him carefully, then stopped at his left flank. Mr. Foster, come here, please. Quickly. Harold climbed the fence, his heart suddenly racing. What is it? What's wrong? Preston was kneeling beside Millionaire, examining something on the bull's hide. Look at this, right here. Harold looked where Preston was pointing. There, partially hidden beneath the bull's now thickening coat, was a series of marks on the skin. They were faded, barely visible, but unmistakable once you knew what to look for. A tattoo, the kind used by elite breeding operations to mark their most valuable animals. Preston pulled a magnifying glass from his pocket and examined the marks more closely. "I can't believe it," he muttered. "I can't believe it's actually him." Harold's mouth went dry. "Him who? What are you talking about?" Preston stood up slowly, his hands trembling slightly. "Mr. Foster, do you know anything about the Blackwood Ranch breeding program?" Harold shook his head. Preston continued, his voice growing more excited. "They were one of the most prestigious cattle breeding operations in the country, specialized in championship bloodlines. Their bulls sold for hundreds of thousands of dollars each. They had one particular line, a genetic sequence that produced animals with extraordinary muscle development, disease resistance, and temperament. But the ranch went bankrupt 7 years ago. Financial mismanagement, bad investments. Everything was liquidated, sold off in pieces. The breeding records were lost, and their prize bulls disappeared into the general livestock population." Harold stared at Millionaire, his mind struggling to process what he was hearing. Preston's voice dropped to almost a whisper. "This tattoo. I helped develop the coding system for Blackwood myself years ago when I consulted for them. This bull, Mr. Foster, is not just any animal. If I'm reading this correctly, and I believe I am, this is Blackwood's Iron Duke, one of the last purebred bulls from their Platinum line. He was valued at over $300,000 before the ranch collapsed." The world seemed to tilt. Harold grabbed the fence to steady himself. "That's impossible. I bought him for $10 at an auction. He was half dead. Nobody wanted him." Preston nodded solemnly. After Blackwood fell apart, their animals were scattered to various small operations and auctions. Without the pedigree papers, without the careful maintenance and nutrition these animals require, they just looked like ordinary cattle. Some probably died. Others were sold for meat. A few ended up at small farms where nobody recognized what they were. This bull, Iron Duke, Millionaire, whatever you want to call him, he probably changed hands several times, each owner knowing less than the last about his true value. By the time he got to that auction, he'd been neglected so badly that he looked worthless. Preston turned to face Harold directly. "But Mr. Foster, with proper care and nutrition, which you've clearly been providing, his genetics will express themselves. In a few months he'll look like what he truly is, one of the finest breeding bulls in the country." Harold sank down onto the grass, his legs no longer able to support him. He looked at Millionaire, who had gone back to grazing peacefully, completely unaware that his entire identity had just been revealed. All those people at the auction, laughing and mocking, Vince Harlow grinning as he sold a worthless bull for $10. None of them had known. None of them had seen what was hidden beneath the suffering. "I didn't buy him because of any bloodline," Harold said quietly. "I bought him because nobody else would, because he reminded me of—" His voice broke. Preston sat down beside him. "Sometimes the most valuable things in life are the ones nobody else recognizes. You saved his life, Mr. Foster, and in doing so, you've preserved something truly extraordinary." News of Millionaire's true identity spread through the community like wildfire. Within days, Harold's quiet farm became a destination. Ranchers, breeders, and curious neighbors showed up unannounced, wanting to see the legendary Blackwood bull that had been rescued from death's door. Television crews from the local news station parked in his driveway. An agriculture magazine sent a photographer. But Harold turned most of them away. He wasn't interested in fame or attention. Millionaire was still recovering, still healing, and Harold protected him fiercely. Dr. Preston returned several times, bringing old Blackwood breeding records he'd managed to locate. He confirmed beyond any doubt that Millionaire was indeed Iron Duke, born 8 years ago at the height of Blackwood Ranch's success. "With your permission," Preston said one afternoon, "I'd like to help you register him properly. His genetics alone make him invaluable to cattle breeding programs across the country. You could earn a fortune in stud fees." Harold considered this, watching Millionaire doze contentedly in the afternoon sun. The bull had transformed remarkably over the past 2 months. His coat gleamed reddish-brown in the light, his muscles were filling out, and he carried himself with a dignity that had been completely absent at the auction. "What happens to him if I do that?" Harold asked. Preston hesitated. "Well, typically, bulls of his caliber are kept at specialized facilities, climate-controlled barns, carefully monitored diets, breeding schedules. He'd be well cared for. I can assure you of that. Harold shook his head slowly. He stays here with me. If people want to use him for breeding, they can come here. But I'm not sending him anywhere. Preston smiled. I thought you might say that. We can arrange it. Over the following weeks, they set up the legal framework. Millionaire was officially registered under both names, Iron Duke on the papers, but Millionaire in practice because that's who he'd become under Harold's care. The first breeding contract came from a ranch 3 states away, offering $15,000. Then another and another. Within a month, Harold had more offers than he could reasonably accept. The money was staggering, more than he'd seen in his entire life of farming, but it felt hollow somehow, meaningless. One evening, Ruth found him sitting on the porch, staring at a stack of contracts. "You look troubled for a man who just became wealthy," she observed, settling into the chair beside him. Harold sighed. "I didn't do this for money. I did it because—" He stopped, struggling to find words. "Because he needed me, because I needed him, and now everyone wants to turn him into a commodity." Ruth was quiet for a moment. "What did Elizabeth always say about your vegetables?" Harold smiled despite himself. "That we grew them with love, not for profit, and that's why they tasted better than anyone else's." Ruth nodded. "This isn't any different. You didn't save Millionaire's life to get rich. You saved him because it was the right thing to do, because you saw value where everyone else saw garbage. The money, the recognition, those are just side effects. They don't change what you did or why you did it." 3 months after the auction, on a crisp autumn morning, Harold walked out to the pasture, where Millionaire now spent his days. The bull had completely transformed. He was magnificent, powerful, healthy, his coat gleaming in the early light. He weighed nearly 2,000 pounds of pure muscle and strength. When Millionaire saw Harold approaching, he walked over to the fence, something he did every morning now. Harold reached through the rails and scratched behind the bull's ears, a gesture that had become their ritual. "You know what today is?" Harold asked softly. 4 months since I bought you for $10. Best $10 I ever spent." Millionaire pressed his massive head against Harold's chest, as gentle as a lamb despite his size. Harold wrapped his arms around the bull's neck, feeling the solid warmth, the steady breathing, the undeniable proof of life. He thought about Elizabeth, about how she'd fought so hard, about those last 3 months when everyone told him to let go but he'd held on anyway. She'd died anyway, yes, but those final months had been precious, sacred. They'd mattered. And standing here now, holding this creature he'd saved, Harold finally understood something he'd been too grief-stricken to see before. Elizabeth's death hadn't made her fight meaningless. And Millionaire's survival hadn't happened to replace her or make Harold forget his pain. They were both about the same thing, about refusing to give up when giving up would have been easier, about seeing value where others saw only loss, about love that persists even when logic says it's pointless. A truck pulled into the driveway, kicking up dust. Harold released Millionaire and turned to see Vince Harlow climbing out. The auctioneer looked uncomfortable, his usual swagger completely absent. He walked over slowly, stopping a few feet away from Harold. For a long moment, neither man spoke. "I heard about the bull," Vince said finally, "about who he really is." Harold waited, saying nothing. Vince shifted his weight. "I came to apologize. I thought I was pulling one over on you that day. Thought you were a grieving old fool throwing money away. I laughed about it for weeks, told everyone how I'd sold you a worthless dying bull and you'd paid for it willingly." His voice dropped. "I was wrong about the bull, about you." Harold studied the man who'd mocked him, who'd grinned while selling what he believed was a dying animal. He felt no anger, no satisfaction at being proven right, only a deep, abiding weariness with the way people measured worth. "You weren't completely wrong," Harold said quietly. "He was dying, and I was grieving. Those things were true." Vince looked confused. "But," Harold continued, "the part you got wrong was thinking those things meant we weren't worth the effort. That's where you and I differ, Vince. You saw a dying bull and a grieving old man, and you saw worthlessness. I saw a dying bull and a grieving old man, and I saw 2 souls who deserved a chance." Vince nodded slowly, then extended his hand. "For what it's worth, I'm glad you bought him, and I'm sorry for being such a jackass about it." Harold shook his hand. "We all make mistakes. What matters is whether we learn from them." After Vince left, Harold returned to the pasture. Millionaire was grazing peacefully, the picture of health and contentment. Harold climbed through the fence and sat down in the grass, his back against a fence post. The bull wandered over and lay down beside him, close enough that Harold could feel his warmth. They sat together in comfortable silence, man and bull, saved and savior, though Harold was no longer certain which was which. The morning sun climbed higher, painting everything in shades of gold. In the distance, Harold could see Ruth's property, the winding road that led to town, the vast sky stretching endlessly above. His phone buzzed with another breeding contract offer. He ignored it. This moment right here was worth more than any amount of money. This quiet peace, this living proof that faith and stubborn love could triumph over impossible odds. Harold thought about all the people who'd laughed at the auction, all the ones who'd told him to give up, to be realistic, to let go. He thought about Travis Mason's initial prognosis, 3 days, maybe 4. He thought about the night Millionaire had developed pneumonia when death had seemed inevitable. And he thought about Elizabeth, always Elizabeth, whose memory had driven him to save this bull in the first place. "I did it, Ellie," he whispered to the wind. "I didn't give up. Just like you taught me." Millionaire's ear twitched at the sound of Harold's voice, but the bull didn't move. They sat together as the morning stretched into afternoon. Two survivors who'd found each other at exactly the right moment. The world had tried to convince them both that they were finished, worthless, better off gone, but they'd proven the world wrong. Not through grand gestures or dramatic victories, but through the simple, stubborn act of holding on, of choosing hope when hope seemed foolish, of believing in value that couldn't be measured in dollars or market prices. Later that evening, as Harold led Millionaire back to the barn, he paused at the gate. The bull stopped too, patient and calm, waiting for his companion. Harold looked at him, really looked at him, and felt overwhelming gratitude wash over him. "You saved me too, you know," Harold said, his voice thick with emotion. "All those people think I saved you, but the truth is we saved each other." Millionaire turned his great head and looked at Harold with those dark, knowing eyes, and in that look, Harold saw understanding, companionship, and something that looked remarkably like love. They walked into the barn together side by side, as the last light of day faded into twilight. Behind them, the empty pasture stood quiet and still, but tomorrow it would be filled with life again. Tomorrow, and all the tomorrows after that. Because Harold Foster had made a choice 4 months ago at an auction house, surrounded by mockery and laughter. He'd chosen compassion over practicality. He'd chosen to see potential where others saw only death. And that choice had changed everything. Not because it had made him wealthy, though it had. Not because it had brought him recognition, though it did that too. But because it had reminded him of the most important truth Elizabeth had ever taught him. That love, real love, doesn't calculate odds or measure worth. It simply refuses to give up. And sometimes, when you refuse to give up on something broken and dying, when you pour your heart into healing what everyone else has abandoned, you discover that you're not just saving a life, you're reclaiming your own. If this story touched your heart, leave your like and subscribe to the channel. Comment, "Millionaire Bull," so I know you stayed with me until the end. Thank you for your company and see you in the next story.